Thank you, Dr. Datta, for inviting me along to talk. As Chris mentioned, I'm sitting down here in, it's actually wet Melbourne right now. We're in a La Nina year, and thankfully all the rain will hopefully prevent us getting too many horrible bushfires this year. Fingers crossed again. As I said, thank you very much for allowing me to speak at this conference. I last spoke at one of the conferences 2 years ago when it was based in Dhaka in Bangladesh, and had a wonderful time there and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I'm very excited to be back here now. Okay, I'm going to be talking about crime and security in this maritime century. But before I go any further, just so that you understand where I come from, I had a merchant navy upbringing and was educated there, followed by 24 years in the Royal Marines, in which time I did a number of maritime security related appointments. I then co-founded and set up the Security Association for the Maritime Industry, which was designed to represent the private maritime security industry and formulate the regulatory structure for private armed guards on merchant ships off the coast of Somalia. I then did a MSc in Maritime Operations and Management, and I now run a consultancy, and I'm the managing editor, as Chris said, of the International Journal of Maritime Crime Security. So in many ways, I've had a hybrid career with 25 years in the Royal Marines, almost 25 years working with the commercial shipping industry, and dipping my toe rather tentatively into the academic world. Okay, what I want to talk about this morning, your time, is the oceans, and just look at it, but look at it more focused on that massive blue area that occupies 70% of the surface of our planet. The criticality of the oceans to the planet, talk about the fact that we're now in a maritime century, and examine the elements of maritime crime and security. Okay, so as I've said, 70% of the planet's surface is covered by sea, and it holds 97% of the world's water and its biosphere. It's the driving force of our weather, climate, planetary chemistry, and the oceans generate more than half our oxygen and has the largest sink of the carbon. The oceans continually yield water that returns to the land as precipitation and back into the ocean. Life on Earth is absolutely dependent upon the oceans, and the Pacific Ocean, just for those of you who haven't thought about it, is large enough to take the whole land mass of the surface of the world and have room to spare. And the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, 16,000 kilometers long, which is quite a bit longer than the Andes. So it's big, you can't get away from it. And indeed, everything that we start to look at once we begin to get into the what happens on the oceans, what is in the oceans, are massive figures. And it takes a while probably to get your head around that. So I say we're in a maritime century. What makes me say that? Well, shortly after we started the century, Somali pirates really grabbed the headlines. And it wasn't long before we were beset by maritime migrants, and many people will remember the horrifying pictures that we saw in the Mediterranean, and we are seeing many photographs of destitute, wretched people trying to cross seaways to get to countries of refuge at the moment. The Blue Planet. Sir David Attenborough's wonderful program brought that to certainly the forefront of many people's minds in the British-speaking world. And pictures like this have been very familiar to many of us. Greta Thunberg, who has, lover or hater, she has done a phenomenal amount for raising the profile of the oceans and indeed many other climate aspects of the world. Rising sea levels. This is an image of what they think New York may look like in quite a long time, but nevertheless, I think that this is something that needs to be thought about. And speaking to you from Australia and having dived here, the Great Barrier Reef and the way that that and many other reefs around the world are becoming bleached. This is happening. Our oceans are becoming far more, or they're hitting the headlines far more often than they ever have done before. And in theory, it could be curing the affliction that we have of institutionalized sea blindness. Okay, so some thoughts to ponder. I've taken the idea of the Maritime Century from a guy called David Brewster, who is at the Australian National University, and Robert Kaplan, a well-renowned geopoliticist, talked about the 20th century was about landscapes, the 21st century will be about seascapes, and that the South China Sea is the Mittel Europa of the 21st century. It's not surprising, really, that oceans have now just begun, because the United Nations Convention on the Sea, Law of the Sea, was signed in 1982. It wasn't actually ratified till 1994. And that was the first thing that really formally established maritime boundaries and zones. Before that, they didn't really exist. And then in 2005, as a result of the 9/11 attacks, the US Maritime Operational Threat Response Plan was published. And this was the very first time that maritime security was recognized as a discrete area of security, taken out from normal areas of security. And it introduced an innovative approach, and that is used by all, owned by none, which I think demonstrates why it is so important to us, and demonstrating the interrelated, interconnected nature of this new area of security. And of course, borders and boundaries on land are largely agreed and accepted. They're also invariably more tangible, easily identified, whereas all boundaries at sea are, with the exception of the baseline, which is the low water mark, which you can see when the tide is going out, whereas boundaries at sea are invisible. And you won't be surprised to hear, therefore, that there are more than 600 maritime boundary disputes ongoing at the moment. So trade by sea. So the IMO will tell us that more than 80% of all global trade moves by sea. And this is a diagram or a figure, graph, taken out of the United Nations Conference for Trade and Development. And they annually produce a review of maritime transport, which produces some outstanding information. And we can see there quite how much maritime trade has increased from when, from 1980, so over the last 40 years. You will see at the extreme right end of this that the slight fall, I hope you can see where my arrow is, which is other dry cargo for 2020. That descent there was probably due largely to the drop in people going on cruise lines. So the global population continues to grow. The record I got today was that it's 7.9 billion and expected to be 10 billion by 2057. So the demand is increasing. And indeed, from a survey carried out by Fair Play, which is a maritime press organization, they said that another 100 million more consumers will join the modern middle class or consumer class each year, give or take. Most of those come from India and China. Now, in 2020, there was a slight reduction, as you can see on the diagram here, to the total tonnage of cargo moved was 10.7 billion tons. And that included, but it did include, and this was an increase of 815.6 million container movements around the world, which went up by about 30 million over the last year. And whilst there has been a reduction caused by coronavirus, maritime trade is expected to grow by 4.3% in 2022 to catch up. We will have seen large amounts of vessels sitting outside, particularly some of the American ports on the West Coast. But that is going to probably continue for a while. Also in 2020, the global commercial fleet increased in size by 40.3 million gross tons. Well, that's a lot, big figure. I warned you about the big figures, but that is equivalent to 620 Queen Elizabeth aircraft carriers, or over 400 US aircraft carriers. And that's just the addition. The total, just so you're aware, the total gross tonnage of the 10 largest navies in the world is 7 million gross tons. Now, of course, warships designed to do different things, but it just shows you quite how much the commercial shipping industry is growing year on year. And those ships are produced, 40% of them, give or take, in China, and the remaining, because 90% of them are produced in Asia, and then the remaining ones are produced in Korea, South Korea, and Japan. So there's a US aircraft carrier. And interestingly, in Global Maritime Trends for 2030, a paper that was published a couple of years ago for 2030, it noted that the key navies, which are listed there, then had 646 warships. By 2030, they'll only have 380. The US Navy can only build 5 warships a year. With a 25-year length of service, that gives you just over 200 warships, which is their expected fleet size. They've already been exceeded by China. In addition to the commercial ships, which I've been talking about, there are more than 4.6 million fishing vessels and an estimated 30 million pleasure craft globally. Okay, now for anybody that is my kind of age, this image may be slightly reminiscent of an album cover that you've seen by Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. I make no apologies for using it because it works really well. Because what I'm going to talk about here is what we thought maritime security was and is. So the traditional way that we looked at maritime security was really warships, grey warships cutting through the ocean, and the vessels bristling with guns and missiles, etc., and aircraft taking off from aircraft carriers and submarines slinking through the water. But what has happened now, rather than it being a single channel, it has diverged and is now far more complex than it ever was before. It is now really a spectrum of maritime security. But unlike the previous picture, which showed you everything in nice little neat lines, of course, it isn't quite like that. They all merge, diverge, and work around each other. But let's just look at it. And I'm going to use Dr. David Sloggett's idea of the 7 dimensions of maritime security. And hopefully at the bottom of the screen in the red, you can just see the violet word state on state, which is really talking about how states are conflicting with states. We're seeing that in a number of places. Chris has already mentioned about the South China Sea. There are areas in the Bay of Bengal between Bangladesh and Myanmar. There are areas off the coast of Somalia between Somalia and Kenya. And only last year, we saw the Eastern Mediterranean being argued over by the Greeks and the Turks with regards to gas reserves. And as I said, there are more than 600 boundary disputes going on in the world over maritime boundaries. Protection of trade. Well, that includes shipping, things like piracy. Ports are absolutely key to the maritime supply chain and have to be looked after, as indeed are submarine cable communications. Over 98% of all connections that we have, indeed, I am speaking to you via a submarine cable right now. So they are absolutely crucial, and the amount of protection that there is for them is very limited. Management of ocean resources, fossil fuels, seafood, undersea mining, which is going to be extremely big, and biotechnology. Smuggling, trafficking, mass maritime migration, and stowaways. This is a complex area that is happening at the moment, and it is likely to happen more. Terrorism at sea, or facilitated by the sea, whether it be things like the taking of ships or mounting attacks like we had in Mumbai in November 2008. Disasters, natural, man-made. It's interesting that the National Geographic magazine now doesn't really talk about natural disasters. It thinks that most of them are man-made because of what we have done. And oceanography. You've already seen the photograph of the Great Barrier Reef. Well, things like that are continuing to happen. But this is the visible spectrum. We can see these things on a day-to-day basis. In the invisible spectrum, i.e. ultraviolet and infrared, we then have things like cybersecurity, which is going on all the time. Corruption, fraud, extortion, and transcontinental organized crime. And of course, climate change. So in summary, the oceans are a vast multi-dimensional area where borders and jurisdictional boundaries are invisible. And unmanaged, they provide a largely unencumbered maneuver space for criminals, terrorists, and nations to exploit. Stable oceans are critical to the health and well-being of the planet. And in this third decade of the 21st century, it is becoming progressively obvious how important the oceans are to so many facets of our lives and our futures. We are living in a maritime century. And maritime security is crucial to the global trade and prosperity. It requires multi-agency and multiple stakeholder approach to manage the interconnected, interrelated challenges that we face. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I shall look forward to answering questions, if you have any, shortly.